Hi, I'm Alan Thurston, author of It Ain't So, Shoeless Joe Jackson's story, which consists of a 2-act play and a 58-page afterword essay where I attempt to the best of my ability to make the case for Shoeless Joe Jackson. This is part 2 of my video presentation. On September 16th or 17th, 1919, several members of the Chicago White Sox met in star pitcher Eddie Cicott's room at the Ansonia Hotel in New York City to conspire to throw the 1919 World Series. Shoeless Joe Jackson was not present at the meeting. A few days later, on either September 19th or 20th in Boston, first baseman Chick Gandil asked Joe if, quote, he would consider $10,000 to frame up something. Joe asked him, frame what? And he told Joe, and Joe told him no. After the team returned to Chicago, Gandil again approached Jackson and offered to pay him $20,000, and Joe again said no. Joe testified before the Cook County grand jury in September 1920 about an encounter he had with gambler Sleepy Bill Burns in the lobby of the Sinton Hotel in Cincinnati the morning of Game 1 of the 1919 World Series. Joe testified the gambler, quote, told me about this stuff and I didn't know so much. Burns said, where is Chick? I said, I don't know. He walked away from me. Obviously going to look for Gandil, who had assured the gambler that the best hitter on the team was part of the plot. Joe further testified, quote, I didn't know enough to talk with them about what they had planned or what they were going to plan or what they had planned. I wouldn't know about it if I had not seen him, end quote. Gene Carney, the late highly esteemed founder and first chairman of the Sabre Black Sox Scandal Research Committee, wrote, quote, Jackson told the grand jury that he knew for sure that something fishy was going on when he was approached by a gambler the morning of Game 1. Joe knew the gamblers thought he was in on the fix, end quote. William Herzog writes, quote, so on the morning of October 1st, 1919, Jackson knew the series was rigged. What did he do? He went to manager Kid Gleason and/or owner Charles Comiskey and informed the ball club. In Shoeless Joe's 1949 Sport magazine interview, he stated, quote, I went to Mr. Comiskey's room at the Sinton Hotel and asked him to keep me out of the lineup. He refused, and I begged him. Tell the newspapers you just suspended me for being drunk or anything, but leave me out of the series and then there can be no question. Baseball writer Hugh Fullerton was in the room and heard the whole thing. Fullerton writes in his 1935 article, I Recall, a description of his own encounter with gambler Bill Burns the day before the series began, tipping him off that the fix was in. The following morning, Fullerton, quote, talked with two big-shot Chicago gamblers who told me that the series was fixed for Cincinnati to win. Fullerton continues, I was much upset and went to Comiskey to urge him to take some action. This is the morning of Game 1. In an interview with Sid Keener, a notable sports writer and later director of the Baseball Hall of Fame, an interview on December 13, 1930, Comiskey admitted, quote, the first inkling I received that something was crooked came when I was informed several hours before Game 1 while I was holding a conference in my Sinton hotel room, presumably with baseball writer Hugh Fullerton. Jacob Pomranke, current chairman of the Sabre Black Sox Scandal Research Committee, writes that the interview, quote, does lend some credence to Fullerton's claim that the White Sox owner had knowledge about the fix before a single pitch was thrown, end quote. It also lends credence, I believe, to Jackson's claim that he spoke to Comiskey in his Sinton hotel room prior to Game 1, after his encounter with the gambler Burns. How else would Joe have known that Fullerton was meeting with Comiskey in Comiskey's hotel room at that time? Why didn't Fullerton ever write anything about Joe's request to be suspended? It can also be asked why it took the reporter 16 years to write about his warning about a fix to Comiskey the morning of Game 1. At the end of his 1935 article, Fullerton states, quote, when the series finally ended, I feared my branding of the games as a fix might lose my friendship with Comiskey, end quote. He did not lose his friendship with the White Sox owner, but he very likely would have had he reported Joe's request to be suspended before a single pitch had been thrown in the World Series while his friend was still alive. Why did he not report it after Comiskey's death? Fullerton would then have had to explain why he had remained silent while Joe was scapegoated and banished from organized baseball. As I mentioned in part one of my video presentation, Joe took the money he had received from Lefty Williams after the last game of the series, which the Southpaw told him was for the use of his name, to show Comiskey and had the door slammed in his face. Comiskey testified at Joe's 1924 civil trial that Jackson did indeed come to his office the day after the World Series ended, waited for an hour, and the White Sox owner did not see him. A month later, in November of 1919, letters were exchanged between Comiskey and the baseball star. The owner offered to pay Joe's expenses if he wished to return to Chicago to discuss the World Series. He informed Jackson that, quote, "There has been a great deal of adverse talk in which your name has been mentioned, reflecting on your integrity in the recent World Series," end quote. Joe immediately responded via his wife, indicating that he wanted to return to Chicago to clear his name and tell what he knew, writing, quote, "Let me hear from you as to when you want me to come to Chicago," unquote. Unsurprisingly, Comiskey never responded to Joe's letter. The letters were presented in evidence at Joe's civil trial in 1924. 10 months later, in September of 1920, the Cook County grand jury was investigating reports involving the fixing of a meaningless Chicago Cubs game when they turned their attention to the rumors swirling about the 1919 World Series. The floodgates opened when an interview with gambler Billy Maharg appeared in the September 28, 1920 edition of the Chicago Tribune, where the gambler claimed that he had been approached by Sox star pitcher Eddie Cicotte, who told him that White Sox players would be willing to throw the upcoming World Series if they were paid $100,000 prior to the first game. Cicotte and Lefty Williams were the only players mentioned in the article. Shoeless Joe was not mentioned. Maharg indicated gamblers Abitel and Bill Burns were involved. The same day the Maharg interview appeared, Eddie Cicotte was summoned to the White Sox management office, where he admitted he had participated in the plot to throw the series. He was escorted to the grand jury room, where he testified that Shoeless Joe had attended the initial meeting of the crooked players at the Antonio Hotel in New York City in mid-September of 1919. However, as previously mentioned, Jackson could not have been there since he had not yet been approached by Chick Gandil about joining the plot. Joe's detractors concede that he did not attend any of the meetings of the crooked players, and gamblers who were there said Joe was not present at any of those meetings. I believe that Shoeless Joe went to the law office of White Sox attorney Alfred Austrian on September 28, 1920, seeking to clear his name as he had attempted to do 10 months before. A reader of William Lamb's Alfred Austrian profile and his 2019 Sabre Baseball Journal article, An Ever-Changing Story, could be excused for believing that the lawyer Austrian, variously described as not a baseball fan, who had never met Shoeless Joe and had rarely if ever attended a ball game, was out of the loop. And what he was learning when the scandal broke was primarily new to him. Lamb writes, quote, "When Joe Jackson was first confronted about his fixed involvement, his inquisitors had only limited information about the matter. Comiskey had presumably imparted the intelligence uncovered by his operatives to Austrian," end quote. Actually, Austrian had a hand in hiring the operatives from the John Hunter Detective Agency, with whom he had worked for years. Austrian testified at Joe's civil trial that some of their reports went directly to him, so they weren't so new to him. They weren't new to him. In his profile entitled Alfred Austrian, Lamb writes, quote, "The extent to which Comiskey's post-series conduct was influenced by club counsel Austrian is, quote, unknowable. It is not at all unknowable." In his statement to the press when the scandal broke, Comiskey wrote, quote, "Immediately upon the conclusion of the 1919 World Series, I took all the facts that I had concerning this series to my attorney, Austrian, placed all the matter before him, and advised him to spare nothing to uncover any wrongdoing that occurred during the World Series." Austrian was quoted in the New York Times September 29, 1920, after Joe Jackson and Lefty Williams' grand jury testimony, quote, Mr. Comiskey and myself, as his counsel, have been working on this for a year. We have spent a great deal of Mr. Comiskey's money to ferret it out. It is because of our investigation that the lid was blown off this scandal, end quote. Testifying at Joe's 1924 civil trial, Austrian was asked, question, did you continue to meet and talk to Mr. Comiskey during the course of this investigation? Say from the time the Hunter Agency was retained in November of 1919 for the 4, 5, 6 months thereafter that the work went on? Austrian, yes, sir, frequently. Question, and did he advise and consult with you concerning the work and the progress of it? Austrian, he did. Question, that continued down to the time the investigation was discontinued? Austrian answered, and afterward. As Charles Fountain writes, quote, Comiskey brought the whole matter to Alfred Austrian, and he brought Austrian up to date on what he knew, what he suspected, and what he feared. From that point forward, as the Black Sox story unfolded over the coming months, nothing happened beyond Austrian's awareness. And much of what happened during that time happened because Austrian and his client Comiskey wanted it to. Comiskey was interested in 3 things: preserving his business, preserving his reputation, and preserving his championship baseball club. Can there be any doubt that Austrian was completely aware of the exchange of letters between Joe and Comiskey in November of 1919? And can there also be any doubt that Austrian played a role in Comiskey's decision not to respond to Joe's offer to return to Chicago to clear his name and tell what he knew? It is clear to me that Austrian and Comiskey did not want to hear what Joe had to say. This brings me to the Comiskey cover-up. White Sox secretary Harry Grabender wrote in his diary, Comiskey summoned 2 of the crooked players, first baseman Chick Gandil and outfielder Happy Felsch, to his office the morning after the World Series ended to discuss his suspicions. Shoeless Joe came to the owner's office that morning on his own. He was not summoned. Jackson told Grabender he had received a bribe from Lefty Williams and he wanted to discuss it with the boss. Grabender told him the boss would not see him. Grabender passed Joe's information, I believe, on to Comiskey. And Happy Felsch himself testified under oath at Joe's 1924 civil trial that during his meeting with Comiskey, quote, Comiskey told me that he knew Williams got money and he knew that Williams gave Jackson money. And I told him that was something new to me. I never knew nothing about it. End quote. Again, this is the day after the series ended. As was mentioned in part 1 of my video presentation, Donald Gropman wrote, quote, Comiskey would not see Joe the morning after the World Series ended because the cover-up was clearly underway, end quote. 2 days later, White Sox manager Kid Gleason, along with 2 team officials, met with gambler Harry Redmond, who gave them many of the details of the fix, the names of the implicated players, and the names of some of the gamblers involved, including Bill Burns, Abe Attell, and Arnold Rothstein. On October 15th, 6 days after the World Series ended, Comiskey offered a reward through the press, stating, quote, there is always a scandal of some kind following a big sporting event like the World Series. These yarns are manufactured out of whole cloth and grow out of bitterness due to losing wagers. I believe my boys fought the battles of the recent World Series on the level, as they have always done. And I would be the first to want information to the contrary. I would give $20,000 to anyone unearthing any information to that effect, end quote. Charles Fountain writes, quote, Austrian first launched a plan for a reward offer. The reward offer was genius. It ensured that any gambler or ball player with information would now be bringing that information to the White Sox. The information thus gathered could be evaluated and used in ways that would best serve Comiskey, burying it if they could, revealing it only if they had to, and judging the bulk of it to be not credible, and thus not deserving the reward, end quote. Gene Carney wrote, quote, Comiskey would simultaneously collect all the evidence he could and suppress that evidence. He knew that if the fix became public knowledge, he could lose the services of some of his most talented baseball players. End quote. Gambler Redmond and others tried to claim the reward, Redmond meeting with Comiskey himself in December of 1919. Henry Seymour writes, quote, "The temptation to protect his investment overcame any original desire Comiskey might have had to get to the bottom of the mess. He reverted to the denial of rumors of crookedness, obviously hoping the whole thing would blow over. And he dismissed the Redmond stories as hearsay." Redmond later indicated, quote, "The indictments finally brought against the players were based on no stronger evidence than that which he had given Comiskey nearly a year before. But at that time, the White Sox officials seemed more interested in the hundreds of thousands of dollars they stood to lose in player property than in clearing up the situation." End quote. Comiskey and Austrian hired the John Hunter Detective Agency, with whom Austrian had previously worked, to find out what information was out there. The agency was not successful in finding, quote, "hard, useful information which convinced Comiskey he could keep the lid on the scandal after all." End quote. Meanwhile, Comiskey's mortal enemy, American League President Ban Johnson, was conducting his own investigation, hoping to blow the lid off the scandal. Team Secretary Grabender believed Johnson was seeking information he could use to destroy Comiskey, drive him out of baseball, and he believed Ban Johnson was trying to put himself in a position where he could buy the White Sox team. Comiskey offered the suspected Black Sox players substantial raises for the 1920 season, and in some cases beyond the 1920 season. Very likely, these raises were in reality hush money. Habby Felsch testified that when Grabender came to his house to sign him in the winter of 1919, Grabender told him, quote, you know that there's a lot of scandal going around, and he says your name is connected with it. And he told me, I'll give you a $3,000 raise in salary." I told him right then. I said, "Mr. Comiskey, it's pretty hard to get any money out of him, and $3,000 seems like a pretty big raise." "Well," Grabender told me, he says, Ban Johnson is making a private investigation, and he has probably hired some detectives, and they are liable to be down there. And if anybody asks you something, just tell them you don't know nothing about nothing." End quote. Question: what did he refer to, Mr. Felsch, if you know? Felsch, the 1919 World Series. Ban Johnson believed that if he could prove that Comiskey had signed players he knew to be corrupt, he could ruin the owner. Henry Seymour wrote, quote, "There was a section in the American League Constitution that provided for the ouster of a club by a 3/4 vote if it failed to expel any player proved guilty of a conspiracy to throw a game." End quote. Silencing Joe Jackson would be a key component of the Comiskey cover-up. If Joe told the grand jury he had asked to be benched prior to Game 1 of the 1919 World Series, that he had tried to show Comiskey the bribe money he had received from Lefty Williams and had the door slammed in his face, and had written a letter in November of 1919, a mere month after the series ended, offering to return to Chicago to tell what he knew, he would give Ban Johnson all the material he would need to drive Comiskey out of the game. What exonerated Joe condemned Comiskey. Donald Gropeman wrote, quote, "As Comiskey's lawyer, Austrian's task was to convince Jackson that the truth would harm him and that his only chance was in confessing his guilt and acting contrite." End part 2.